According to analysis by Lawrence O'Donnell, Donald Trump's remarks during the early days of the conflict with Iran sparked controversy because of the contrast between what he spoke about and the realities of the war. In a speech delivered in the East Room of the White House, Trump spent considerable time discussing decorative details in the room, particularly the gold drapes and plans for a new ballroom that he said he had selected during his previous term. At the same time, reports from the battlefield indicated that the number of American military casualties in the conflict was rising, leading some commentators to question the president's focus on interior decor. While the country was engaged in a military confrontation, O'Donnell argued that this moment illustrated how Trump communicates during wartime. Rather than emphasizing the loss of soldiers' lives or explaining the military strategy behind the conflict, Trump's comments centered on personal preferences and renovations inside the White House. Critics say this created an image of a leader who was not sufficiently addressing the human cost of the war. As the conflict intensified and airstrikes continued, debate in Washington expanded beyond military tactics to include how the administration was presenting the war to the public and how those messages might shape perceptions of the conflict both in the United States and internationally. On the third day of the conflict between the United States and Iran, Donald Trump appeared in the majestic East Room of the White House and delivered remarks that quickly drew attention for their unusual focus. Standing in one of the most iconic rooms of the presidential residence, Trump praised the beauty of the building and spoke at length about renovations taking place inside it. He pointed to the gold-colored drapes hanging in the room and explained that they were covering construction work behind them, part of a plan to build a new ballroom that he said would eventually become one of the most beautiful in the world. Trump noted that he had personally chosen those drapes during his first term, and even joked that the design looked so impressive he might save money by not installing additional doors. To some observers, the moment was striking because it came at a time when the United States had already entered a military confrontation with Iran. Critics pointed out that while the president was speaking enthusiastically about interior design and architecture, American troops were already being killed in the conflict. Earlier that same day, the publicly reported number of American military casualties had reached 4. By the end of the day, that number had risen to 6. Yet even after the increase was confirmed, Trump had not publicly addressed the deaths during his remarks. When the conflict began, Trump acknowledged that casualties were a possibility, stating that such losses often happen during war. His defense secretary echoed that sentiment during a briefing, saying that an operation of that scale inevitably involves casualties, and that war, by its nature, brings suffering and loss. At the same time, the defense secretary also stated that the U.S. military would be operating without what he described as unnecessary or restrictive rules of engagement. In military terms, rules of engagement normally define the limits on when and how force can be used. Critics quickly warned that removing such constraints could signal a far more aggressive approach to the conflict. Both Trump and members of his administration have repeatedly referred to the military campaign against Iran as a war. That language carries significant legal implications. Under the United States Constitution, the power to declare war belongs to Congress rather than the president. Legal experts have pointed out that the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was created precisely to prevent presidents from initiating prolonged military conflicts without congressional authorization. Under that law, a president may initiate hostilities only under specific circumstances. If Congress formally declares war, if Congress provides explicit statutory authorization, or if the United States faces a national emergency created by an attack on its territory, armed forces, or possessions. Critics argue that none of those conditions were clearly invoked when the military strikes against Iran were launched. Former federal prosecutor Ankush Kardori wrote that the operation appears to cross several legal boundaries, both domestically and internationally, raising questions about whether the president exceeded his constitutional authority. International law has also become part of the debate. Reports surrounding the military campaign raised the possibility that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, might have been considered a potential target. However, international legal norms generally prohibit the assassination or targeting of a sitting head of state. If such an action had been planned or attempted, critics argue it could raise serious questions about compliance with international law. Following a classified briefing with the administration's top national security officials, Senator Mark Warner, the leading Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, publicly stated that there had been no evidence of an imminent threat to the United States from Iran. Warner acknowledged that Iran posed a threat to Israel, but he warned that equating threats against Israel with an immediate threat to the United States would represent a dramatic shift in American security policy and could potentially justify future military interventions in a much wider range of conflicts. At the same time, The projected timeline for the conflict itself has already begun to shift. Early statements from administration officials suggested that the military action might last only a few days. More recent comments from Trump, however, indicated that the operation could extend for months. Critics argue that this shift reflects uncertainty about the long-term goals of the campaign. Trump has offered several explanations for the military action, including weakening Iran's military capabilities and potentially encouraging regime change. In one speech, Trump addressed members of the Iranian military directly, urging them to lay down their weapons. He promised that if they did so, they would be treated fairly and granted immunity, while warning that those who refused could face death. Observers immediately questioned how such a scenario would realistically unfold. If Iranian soldiers were to surrender, who would guarantee their safety? Who would grant the immunity that Trump promised? And who would ensure that they were not attacked by other forces within Iran? Trump also spoke directly to the Iranian public, telling them that the moment of their freedom had arrived. He urged civilians to stay indoors while bombing was taking place and suggested that once the strikes ended, they should rise up and take control of their government. Critics argue that this message places the burden of political change on the very people whose country is being bombed. They also point out that similar messages have appeared in earlier American wars. During the first Gulf War in 1991, President George H.W. Bush encouraged the Iraqi people and military to overthrow Saddam Hussein. That uprising never materialized, and Saddam remained in power for more than a decade afterward. Years later, Bush's son, President George W. Bush, launched another war in Iraq, stating that the United States had no ambitions other than removing a threat and restoring control of the country to its people. Similar language appeared during the war in Afghanistan, when American leaders repeatedly emphasized that the United States was not fighting the Afghan people, but rather the extremist groups that controlled the government. Military strikes were accompanied by humanitarian aid deliveries, including food, medicine, and supplies dropped from aircraft to civilians affected by the fighting. Throughout modern history, American presidents launching military operations have often emphasized that the United States remains a friend to the people of the countries being bombed. The message has frequently been that America opposes the government of those nations, not their citizens. Whether that distinction feels meaningful to people living under the bombs, however, has long been a matter of debate. For many civilians caught in the middle of war, the difference between targeting a government and impacting the lives of ordinary people can be difficult to see when the consequences of conflict unfold around them.